thanks very much, Liz, and very good to be here. I think my slot was sort of designed to do the scaremongering on cybersecurity and convince you of all of the threat. I don't think I need to do that looking at the audience and sitting through some of the really interesting earlier sessions. I'm not going to labour that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on statistics, partly because any statistic in cyber is pretty meaningless. We don't really know what 100% of the threat is, so trying to do anything below that is difficult. But I think we can all agree that over the last 5 years, the volume and sophistication of cyber threats has grown exponentially. And law enforcement, Interpol put the projected cyber fraud losses at $3 trillion for next year, which is a guess, but not an unreasonable one, and 3/4 of all businesses affected. And we kind of know that, I think. But the two statistics that really grabbed my attention in the last couple of weeks, and which something I want to talk about this afternoon, which is sort of the fintech side of this, is one, a survey, one of many surveys of bank CEOs about fintech, where 3/4 of those of the CEOs said the thing that worried them most about fintech was not the integration or the commercial issues, it was the security and resilience, which I thought was actually quite encouraging from a cybersecurity point of view, but interesting. The other one, which is related, is in Hiscox's cyber readiness report, which came out last week. They were saying that 2/3 of firms, they've been surveying the same firms in roughly the same countries for some years now, but 2/3 had experienced supply chain or vendor cyber problems and attacks over the last year. So I think those are saying the same things, really, which is what I want to talk about in just a few minutes. And that is that third-party risk is the central issue as we roll out fintech. So let me make a few comments about that from three perspectives. From the perspective of the CISO, I work a lot, particularly with US CISOs in banks. So if you like, the procurers and to some extent the competitors of the fintech sector. To talk a little bit about the criminal groups in the middle, I don't know what party they are, the sort of party crashers, I suppose. I don't work with them, but I have worked against them in the past in government and now in the private sector, and I see inside a lot of what they do. And then, of course, the third parties themselves. So I want to finish saying something about the fintech sector and cybersecurity, and let me do those just a couple of minutes on each. First, from the CISO point of view, I think if you're a really successful CISO and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in the case of Wall Street banks on cybersecurity, and you've got a really good, maybe over-sophisticated risk management approach in place, and you've got the attention of your board in a way that you couldn't have dreamed of 5 years ago, and maybe a bit more attention than you want, and is helpful. It's not always the right kind of attention, but you've got it, and you're spending all that money. And you may think you've got your security pretty good by most of the frameworks that we measure these things by, including sort of NIST or NCSC over here. And then you're realizing over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, that you have thousands, certainly hundreds, but in the case of big US institutions, thousands of vendors, suppliers, service providers connected to you who are largely an unquantified risk. And that's, of course, where fintech fits in and will fit in the future. And what do you do? Well, you can go in and pen test or do all the usual on-the-ground audits and visits of a handful, maybe 5% of those vendors. And doing that, you get a snapshot, which is valuable, but it is only a snapshot. For the rest, you're probably just sending them a questionnaire, and you're asking them a bunch of questions, which in my experience, the better the answers, probably the worse their security, because they probably don't know the vulnerabilities that they're carrying. And that's assuming that they are completely open with you, which not all vendors are with their customers. So there is a huge problem here, and it's a problem which, coming on to the second group, criminals are very aware of and are beginning to exploit. So where we can see inside criminal groups, we see really sophisticated business models. There's been a lot written about this recently, thanks partly to FBI work on particular crime groups. Of course, there are still low-level fraudsters, and we're all suffering from them, and they can actually make quite a lot of money in aggregate. But it's the big groups that I think we worry about. And when you can see inside some of these groups and see the closed forums they're using, they're discussing particular bank payment systems, they're discussing particular products and how to defraud them, how to get through them. And interestingly, they're discussing quite imaginative profit-sharing models. So if they sell a particular cyber fraud tool, what percentage of the profit are they going to get? So in their own way, quite impressive, actually. And what's happening, as always with crime, is as the banks harden their defenses, and financial services has obviously always been top of that league table of targets after government from nation states. It's top of the league table of criminal targets for the obvious reason that's where the money is. And as the financial sector gets better, spends more money, gets more skills and expertise, criminals don't just give up. They look for the soft underbelly. So what's the way in? And they have realized that the vendors and the supply chain are the way in. Going up the supply chain is the way into their key targets. And they're applying the kind of creativity and resources to this that we saw applied to narcotics, say, at the end of the last century. It's amazing to see. Came across one really interesting example in the last couple of months in Mexico, where a criminal group had placed someone inside a software company which was working for a particular bank which they were wanting to target. And it wasn't let to run long enough to know whether they had placed that person to simply to inform on how the bank worked and how its networks worked, or whether they were being more ambitious and actually hoping to affect the software itself and give themselves a kind of backdoor. But that's, I think, that's the place they will go next. And the only reason we've not seen more of this against the disruptors and against the fintech companies is for the same reason that we see more attacks on Windows than we do on Apple, because their volume isn't there yet. And as that shifts, as the disruptors take more of market share, I think we can absolutely assume that criminal attention will inevitably follow. So let me come to the fintech sector. Where does that leave us? And I work with a number of startups. I chair an incubator for government in East London, and I see another one in West London, and and also in the US and Singapore. So I have a fairly broad view of what's going on in the startup end of fintech, and I think there are a number of problems which I'd sort of point to in just a couple of minutes. One is obviously the culture of fintech, and the motivation can be sort of inimical to cybersecurity. So rapid growth, innovation, convenience, usability, agility, all the things that we're discussing in other parts of these 2 days, can, if they're not handled properly, be weaknesses in terms of security and resilience. And I put the two together because I think resilience is as important, possibly more important than narrow cybersecurity. The second, obviously, flows from that is resources. Startups and smaller companies don't have the massive IT budgets, they don't have the massive IT security budgets, and security-focused talent, which is hard to find anyway, and they don't have their own infrastructure in the way that the big traditional banks do. They wouldn't want it, of course, that's the whole point of being a disruptor. But it brings with it a vulnerability, a worry, particularly for government, I think. And then for those reasons, fintech companies are typically outsourcing just about everything they can. For example, outsourcing their domain hosting to third-party providers. And that, I think the worry there is not only one of security, but it's a single point of failure if things go wrong, as they have done actually in the last several times in the last 2 years. And an extension of that outsourcing is that obviously, by definition, many of these companies that we are celebrating today are reliant on public cloud services for storage and processing. And I think a challenge to any fintech company, certainly from the CISO point of view, is do they have a network hosting strategy that has security as a priority? Maybe not the only priority, but as a serious priority. How secure is their online footprint and infrastructure? And for the average direct bank, for example, that's a really open question. Some clearly have got it covered. Others haven't. They've really outsourced it and don't really know, frankly. It's not the place to go into, and the time to go into the things that should be asked of cloud service providers, but the National Cybersecurity Centre has put out 14 very, very sensible questions and areas to probe on cloud security. I'm just looking at it here, actually, but the one that stands out for me is separation between users, of which I've seen some really pretty disastrous examples in recent years. But there are 13 other really sensible things to look at in cloud there. And of course, many of the companies here in this two-day event are reliant on the front end, on mobile platforms, on the customer end, if you like. And that is, as we all know, a pretty insecure environment, partly for the identity management reasons that we were just discussing in the very, very good panel before this. And we've already seen criminals exploiting those vulnerabilities at scale, exploiting mobile apps to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks or cross-site scripting. We're all familiar with that. But for example, the selfie verification that some banks are now using, particularly in the States, has already been mimicked by phishing sites. They are as happy to collect images of the customers they want to defraud as they are any other data about them. So it is already happening. And I think, bluntly, the answer is going to have to be a partnership, close partnership between traditional and disruptor in financial services. And on the issue of identity management, completely agree with Kerry Goldman from Santander, who was just at the last panel. We need diversity in that, but we also need a public-private partnership. We need government to play its part, but it's going to have to be, I'm afraid, private sector-led. Which brings me finally, in the last minute really, to regulators, which again were discussed at earlier panels, so I won't labour it. But yeah, as always, it's hard for the regulators to keep up. They have some great people, but they don't have enough of them. They don't have enough cybersecurity skills. Nobody does. Government and regulators are less able to pay for them than much of industry. So they're starting behind the curve, if you like. And of course, they're pulled in two directions. Government is strongly pushing the interests of customers, pushing access. That's where obviously open banking comes from, pushing competition. But the downside of all of that is, the tension of all of that, I think, is a worry about regulation on cybersecurity, which I know that the FCA and the EBA and various US regulators are all turning their minds to. I think I would agree with the last panel, they're not doing it in enough detail yet. We need much more detail, and we need it agreed between regulators and ideally between jurisdictions. We don't want 10 different versions of the same or the similar intended regulation. That would be a disaster and in its own way an opportunity for criminals. But it will happen. I think it's just going to take some time, and it will take both public and private to play their part. But to finish, the only way that fintech is going to be successful, and I'm an optimist, someone who celebrates what we've been celebrating in these 2 days, which is the fantastic potential of fintech and the fantastic innovation that's going on. But if it's going to fulfill its potential, it needs to make sure that it doesn't become the soft underbelly into the finance sector. That would be a disaster for public confidence in all these services. No one wants to be the first major finance disruptor to go down because of loss or corruption of data. And for that matter, no established CISO wants to be taken down with it. So there's an interest in everybody in getting this right, including government. And on that reasonably optimistic note, I'll leave it to the next panel. I do think this can be done, and the benefits massively outweigh the risks, but we do need to keep worrying about the risks, and as always, build in security at the start, not try to retrofit it afterwards. So thank you very much.